In the early 1920s, the Osage Nation of Oklahoma were the wealthiest people per capita on the face of the earth. They owned mansions. They drove the latest automobiles. They hired white servants. They sent their children to the best schools in the country. Their wealth was real, documented, and extraordinary, and someone was killing them for it. Between 1918 and 1926, at least 60 members of the Osage Nation were murdered or died under circumstances so suspicious that the region earned a name that has never left it. They called it the Reign of Terror. The killers were their neighbors, their guardians, their lawyers, their doctors, and in at least one devastating case, the husband of a woman who had no idea that the man sleeping beside her every night was slowly poisoning her to death. This is the story of the Osage murders. It is a story about greed so absolute it had no floor, about a system so corrupt it protected killers for years, about a woman named Molly who survived when almost everyone she loved did not, and about how the FBI, then barely an organization at all, built its first major case on the bones of the people no one had bothered to protect. To understand what happened in Osage County in the 1920s, you need to understand something that American history rarely tells clearly, that the Osage Nation had not simply survived the displacement and destruction that the United States government had visited upon Native peoples across the continent. They had, through a combination of extraordinary foresight and remarkable fortune, managed to do something almost no one expected. They had become rich, genuinely, spectacularly, almost incomprehensibly rich. The Osage had originally lived in the Ohio and Missouri River valleys. Over the course of the 18th and 19th centuries, they were pushed steadily westward, signing treaty after treaty, ceding land after land, until by the 1870s they were living on a reservation in southern Kansas. When that land, too, was taken for white settlement, the Osage did something that would prove to be one of the most consequential decisions in their history. They pooled their own money, the proceeds from the sale of their Kansas lands, and bought a rocky, hilly, seemingly worthless piece of territory in northeastern Oklahoma. They bought it outright, with their own funds, which meant that when it was formally designated as Osage County, the subsurface mineral rights belonged entirely to them. Nobody thought this was particularly significant at the time. The land looked barren. It was rocky and difficult to farm. The Osage had been given what everyone assumed was the worst deal available. And then, in the late 1890s, they found oil. Not a little oil, an ocean of it. One of the largest petroleum deposits in the United States lay directly beneath the land the Osage had bought with their own money. Under the Osage Allotment Act of 1906, subsurface minerals within the reservation were held in trust by the U.S. government, but tribally owned, with the royalties paid equally to every enrolled member of the Osage Nation through what was called a head right. One per person, hereditary, passing to the immediate legal heir when an Aladi died. And critically, one did not have to be Osage to inherit an Osage head right. That detail seems small. It was not small at all. By 1923, at the height of the oil boom, the Osage tribe as a whole was earning more than $30 million a year. The average Osage family of 5 was receiving the equivalent of over $1 million annually in today's money. They were building beautiful homes in the Oklahoma towns of Fairfax and Pawhuska. They were buying Pierce Arrows and Cadillacs. They were wearing tailored clothes and hosting dinner parties. They were, by every measurable standard, living extraordinarily well. And the people living around them, the white settlers, the ranchers, the businessmen, the opportunists who had flooded into Oklahoma when it became a state in 1907, were watching all of this with an emotion that was not admiration. The federal government had a problem, or rather, it decided it had a problem, which is a different thing. The problem, as Washington saw it, was that the Osage had too much money and might not know what to do with it. This was a paternalistic assumption that had no basis in the evidence, given that the Osage had demonstrated considerably more financial sophistication than most of the white settlers around them by purchasing their own reservation outright with their own funds. But in 1921, Congress created a guardian system. Under this system, Osage tribal members were required to prove their competence to manage their own money. The tests were deliberately difficult, designed around material that most Osage had never been taught, covering concepts of American financial law that bore no relationship to how any ordinary person managed their finances. Most full-blooded Osage failed these tests and were assigned guardians, generally prominent white citizens of Oklahoma, who were given legal authority over every financial decision their Osage wards made. And I want you to understand what this meant in practice. These guardians had to approve purchases. Any purchase. Osage citizens who were, by any objective measure, among the wealthiest people in the country needed written permission from a white guardian to buy a car, to build a room on their house, to pay a bill. In some cases, the documentation shows that Osage people needed guardian approval to buy toothpaste. This was not protection. This was a mechanism, a legal, government-sanctioned mechanism that placed the wealth of the Osage Nation directly into the hands of the white community around them. Historian Dennis McAuliffe documented that 600 guardians took $8 million in surplus Osage funds alone, with no oversight and no accountability, over the course of just 3 years. The guardian system was, within a very short time, functioning less as a protection for the Osage and more as an organized transfer of Osage wealth to white Oklahomans. It happened at scale. It happened openly, and almost no one in a position of authority did anything to stop it. But the guardian system, as corrupt as it was not the worst of what was happening in Osage County, because there was a faster way to get an Osage head right than skimming from it over years. You could simply inherit it, and head rights, under the 1906 Act, passed to the immediate legal heir of the deceased Aladi, and that heir did not have to be Osage at all. All you needed was for the head right holder to die. William King Hale arrived in what is now Osage County around 1902. He came from Greenville, Texas, and he arrived with almost nothing, living in a tent, working as a ranch hand, building his way up from poverty through a combination of hard work, relentless ambition, and a willingness to do things that other people were not willing to do. By the 1920s, he had become the most powerful figure in Osage County. He owned cattle ranches and banking interests. He had political connections that reached into the state government. He had cultivated relationships with every important person in the region, and he was known, with a combination of respect and fear, as the king of the Osage Hills. A 1926 newspaper account described him as about 5'7" and 155 pounds, with what it called a splendid physique and an erect and springy walk. A later writer remarked on his thick glasses, which gave him a deceptively benign, friendly look. He looked like a grandfather. He acted like a community pillar. He was present at church events and charity functions. He was, in public, the kind of man that towns build statues to. And he had decided, sometime in the years before 1918, to get rich from Osage oil, not through hard work or legitimate investment, through murder. The plan Hale constructed was patient, methodical, and almost elegant in its logic. He had a nephew, a young man named Ernest Burkhart, who had followed him from Texas to Oklahoma. Hale encouraged Ernest to court and marry an Osage woman named Molly Kyle. Molly was a full-blooded Osage with a head right. She was also a woman with a large family, a mother named Lizzie, and 3 sisters named Minnie, Anna, and Rita. Each of them had head rights. Each of those head rights was worth a fortune. And under the inheritance rules, if they died, their head rights passed to their closest heirs, which meant, eventually, to Molly. And if Molly died, they passed to her husband Ernest. And Ernest, as Hale's nephew, was a man Hale could control entirely. The mathematics of what Hale was planning were straightforward. Kill Molly's family one by one. Let the head rights accumulate in Molly's name. Then kill Molly. Everything flows to Ernest. Ernest hands it to Hale. The king of the Osage Hills becomes legitimately the wealthiest man in Oklahoma. What makes this case psychologically extraordinary is not just the calculation of it. It is the patience. Hale did not rush. He built relationships with the Kyle family over years. He was present at family events. He was friendly with Molly. He was, by all accounts, genuinely liked by the people he was planning to kill. And he began, carefully and quietly, to act. The first death came in 1918. Minnie, the youngest of Molly's sisters, was 27 years old and seemingly healthy when she began to waste away from what was described as a mysterious illness. She died slowly, her body failing over weeks, and nobody could explain why. Her death was recorded and moved past. These things happen, people said. Then, On the morning of May 27, 1921, local hunters found the decomposing body of Anna Brown in a remote ravine in Osage County. Anna was 36 years old. She was Molly's sister. The initial examination concluded she had died of alcohol poisoning. The case was set aside, but the undertaker who prepared Anna's body for burial found something the initial examination had missed: a bullet hole in the back of her head. Anna Brown had not died of alcohol poisoning. She had been shot in the back of the head and left in a ravine, and the local authorities had been so uninterested in the death of an Osage woman that they had almost missed the evidence entirely. Even after the bullet was found, the case was not seriously investigated. She was Osage. In Osage County, in 1921, that was reason enough for a murder to go unsolved. 2 months after Anna's body was found, her mother, Lizzie, died. Lizzie had been in apparent good health. Her death was attributed to causes unknown. With her death, she passed additional head rights she had inherited from a deceased first husband and 2 daughters, to her surviving children. In January 1923, Lizzie's nephew Henry Roan was found shot to death in his car on a remote stretch of road. Henry had a $25,000 life insurance policy. The beneficiary was William Hale. Then, on March 10, 1923, a house in Fairfax, Oklahoma, was destroyed by an explosion in the early hours of the morning. Inside the house were Molly's sister Rita, her husband William Smith, and their housekeeper Nettie Brookshire. All 3 died in the blast. The explosion had been powerful enough to be heard miles away. Investigators found evidence that a large quantity of nitroglycerin had been placed beneath the house and detonated deliberately. 3 deaths in 2 years within a single family. A cousin shot on a remote road. A mother dead of unknown causes. And now a house blown apart before dawn. The Osage community knew what was happening. They had been saying it for years. Nobody with the authority to act was listening. Through all of this, Molly Burkhart was still alive. She had lost her youngest sister in 1918, her sister Anna in 1921, her mother weeks later, her cousin Henry in 1923, her sister Rita and brother-in-law in the same year. She was grieving, constantly, in a way that no person should ever have to grieve, loss after loss after loss, with no explanation and no justice. And she was also becoming ill, a slow, wasting illness that her doctors could not identify. She was weakening progressively, losing weight, losing energy, losing the clarity of thought that her family described as one of her most defining qualities. She was taken to doctors repeatedly. Nobody could find a cause. And then came the detail that, when it finally emerged, was perhaps the most devastating thing in an already devastating case. Molly was being poisoned, slowly, carefully, over a long period of time. The poison was being administered in small doses, not enough to kill quickly, but enough to erode her health steadily, week by week, until her body gave out and her death could be recorded as natural. The person administering the poison was Ernest Burkhart, her husband, the man she lived with, ate with, slept beside, trusted completely, the man who had held her hand at her sister's funeral, at her mother's funeral, who had sat with her through grief after grief, while quietly ensuring that each grief would be followed by another, and that the last grief would be her own. The FBI's own report states it explicitly. When Molly was finally removed from Ernest's control, she immediately regained her health. The poisoning had been working. It just had not had time to finish. In March 1923, the Osage Tribal Council did what they had been trying to do for 2 years. They formally petitioned the United States government to intervene. They had hired private investigators who had been threatened, bribed, and in some cases killed before they could make progress. They had gone to local law enforcement and been ignored. They had gone to state authorities and been dismissed. Now they went directly to Washington and demanded federal help. The Bureau of Investigation, the agency that would eventually become the FBI, assigned agents to the case. The director of the time, J. Edgar Hoover, understood that this was an opportunity. His agency was young, underfunded, and struggling to establish itself as a serious law enforcement organization. A high-profile case with a successful resolution could change that. He sent agents to Osage County, but they quickly discovered the scale of the problem. Hale had been in Osage County for 20 years. He knew everyone. He had compromised everyone: local sheriffs, judges, lawyers, witnesses. The false leads were constant, so the Bureau changed tactics. They sent a team of undercover agents, men who arrived with cover identities and built relationships from scratch. An insurance salesman, a cattle buyer, an oil prospector, an herbal doctor. They moved through the community for months, gaining trust, listening, watching, and they kept hearing the same three names: William Hale, Ernest Burkhart, John Ramsey. The breakthrough came through the weakest link. Ernest Burkhart, under sustained pressure, began to crack. He had married Molly because his uncle told him to. He had watched her family be killed because his uncle arranged it. He had poisoned his own wife because his uncle instructed him to. When it became clear that the investigation was closing in, Ernest made a calculation that Hale had not anticipated. He talked. The agent who led the investigation was a former Texas Ranger named Tom White, a tall, quiet man from a tradition of frontier law enforcement who found himself navigating the most complex conspiracy case the Bureau had ever handled. The people who worked with him described him as patient in a way that most people are not patient, willing to wait for weeks or months for the right moment, rather than force a confrontation that might collapse the case. It was White's team who finally built the evidence that brought Hale to trial, and it was his relationship with the Osage community, built over months of genuine listening, that gave investigators the access they needed to understand what had really happened. In January 1926, federal agents arrested three men. The first was William Hale, the king of the Osage Hills, the architect of everything, the man who had spent years building a conspiracy so patient and so carefully constructed that it had taken the Bureau of Investigation months of undercover work to untangle it. The second was Ernest Burkhart, Hale's nephew, Molly's husband, the weak-willed instrument through whom Hale had operated, who had married a woman on his uncle's instruction and poisoned her on his uncle's instruction, and who, when the pressure of the investigation finally became too much, had broken and talked. And the third was a man named John Ramsey. Ramsey was not a sophisticated figure. He was a local farmer and cowboy in his 50s, described in the FBI's own records as a typical rough-type Western criminal who had previously served time in a penitentiary. He had no elaborate plan and no long-term financial motive. What he had was a willingness to do things that other people were not willing to do, and a relationship with Hale that made him useful. Hale had hired him, paid him, to carry out specific murders that Hale himself could not afford to be directly connected to. It was Ramsey who had been present when Molly's cousin Henry Roan was killed on that remote stretch of road in January 1923. Under interrogation, after Ernest had already confessed and the walls had closed in, Ramsey admitted that Hale had hired him to ensure Roan died. He also implicated himself in the Smith House explosion and named additional co-conspirators, including a man named Henry Grammer and another named Asa Kirby, who had been recruited specifically to carry out the bombing. A local bootlegger named Kelsey Morrison, who admitted to shooting Anna Brown in the back of the head at Hale's direction, was also charged separately. The arrest sent a visible shock through Osage County. The king of the Osage Hills, who had spent 20 years making himself untouchable, was in federal custody. And the man who had hired people to kill for him, and the man who had poisoned his own wife for him, were sitting in cells alongside him. The federal case held, but it took years, and it took 4 separate trials before a conviction finally stuck. Hale and Ramsey were tried twice in the federal district court at Guthrie, once in Oklahoma City and once in Pawhuska. The first conviction was overturned on appeal. Each time Hale's lawyers found something to challenge, and each time the case had to be rebuilt and retried. The Bureau of Investigation's investment in this case was enormous, in time, in resources, and in the careers of the agents who had spent months undercover building evidence that kept having to be represented to new juries. On January 27, 1929, more than 3 years after the initial arrests, William Hale was finally convicted of the murder of Henry Roan and sentenced to life imprisonment at the federal penitentiary in Leavenworth, Kansas. 10 months later, on November 20th, 1929, John Ramsey was convicted of the same murder and received the same sentence. Ernest Burkhart, who had confessed and turned state's evidence against his uncle and Ramsey, accepted a plea arrangement for his role in the murder of William Smith and also received a life sentence. Kelsey Morrison, who had admitted to shooting Anna Brown, received a life sentence as well. It looked, from the outside, like justice. But here is something worth being honest about. When you look at what Hale's plan actually achieved versus what it was designed to achieve, the picture is more complicated than a simple story of greed punished. Hale's plan, at its core, was built on a chain. Kill Molly's family one by one, so she inherited their head rights. Then kill Molly, so Ernest inherited everything. Then extract that wealth from Ernest. The plan required every link in that chain to hold, and the last and most important link never did. Molly survived. The FBI investigation caught up with Ernest before the poisoning finished its work, and when Molly was removed from his control, she immediately regained her health, exactly as the FBI's own report records. So what did Hale actually get? The $25,000 life insurance payout on Henry Roan went directly to him the moment Roan was killed. He had named himself as the beneficiary. During the years of the conspiracy, Ernest's access to Molly's increasing income, her head right had grown as she inherited from her dying family members, provided Hale with indirect financial benefits through the control he exercised over his nephew. And his broader position of power in Osage County, built on corruption and intimidation over 2 decades, had made him wealthy through mechanisms well beyond the murders themselves. But the grand endgame, the accumulated fortune of the entire Lizzie Q family, flowing through Molly to Ernest to Hale, never arrived. He killed people for a fortune he never received. That detail does not make the murders less monstrous. It does not reduce the grief of the Osage community by a single fraction. But it does add something to the portrait of Hale, a man so certain of his own ability to control outcomes that he committed years of murders in pursuit of a payday that the intervention of a federal investigation prevented him from ever collecting. The plan failed. The victims remained dead, and the fortune stayed, at least partially, where it belonged. But here is what justice actually looked like for the Osage Nation. Of the 60 or more murders committed during the Reign of Terror, exactly 4 people were sentenced. The broader conspiracy, the dozens of other people who had participated in or facilitated the killings, the guardians who had stolen $8 million from their Osage wards, the doctors who had falsified death certificates, the lawyers who had helped transfer head rights through fraudulent means. None of them were prosecuted. Most of the murders were never even properly investigated. The deaths were buried in county records as natural causes or causes unknown, and the people responsible for them lived out their lives in Osage County without consequence. And even the 4 who were convicted did not stay convicted for long. Despite strong and sustained objections from the Osage Nation, all 3 men were eventually paroled. Ernest Burkhart was paroled in 1937, though he later returned to prison after committing robbery, and was eventually granted a full pardon by Oklahoma Governor Henry Bellman in 1965. William Hale was paroled in 1947 after serving only 18 years of his life sentence, at the age of 72. He lived to be 87 years old and is buried in Wichita, Kansas. The king of the Osage Hills died a free man, decades after the crimes that should have defined his legacy. In 1925, while the investigation was still ongoing, Congress passed a law prohibiting non-Osage people from inheriting the head rights of tribal members who possessed more than 1/2 Osage blood. It was a direct response to the Reign of Terror, an attempt to close the legal loophole that had made the killings possible. But read that carefully. The law came in 1925. The murders had been happening since at least 1918. For 7 years, the federal government had known that the inheritance rules for Osage head rights were creating a direct financial incentive to kill Osage people. The guardian system had been creating opportunities for theft and exploitation since 1921. The Osage Tribal Council had been petitioning Washington for help since before the first formal investigation began. And the law that should have been passed years earlier finally arrived in 1925, after dozens of people were dead. The case also did something else. It helped create the FBI. The Osage murders investigation was the first major criminal case the Bureau of Investigation handled, and its successful resolution gave Hoover the credibility and political capital to transform his agency into what it became. The FBI was built, in part, on the bones of the Osage Nation. Molly Burkhart survived. She divorced Ernest after learning what he had done. She lived until 1937, long enough to see the trials conclude and the convictions entered. She lost her mother, 3 sisters, a cousin, and years of her own health to the conspiracy her husband and his uncle had built around her. The historical record does not tell us much about the years she lived after the trials. We do not know what she felt, or how she carried it, or whether she found anything that resembled peace. What we know is that she survived something that was designed to kill her, and that the people who loved her did not. The Osage Nation is still here. They are a sovereign nation with a tribal government headquartered in Pawhuska, Oklahoma. They have preserved the history of what happened to their community in the 1920s, and they have fought for decades to ensure that it is remembered accurately and completely, not as a story about the FBI or about William Hale or about the birth of American law enforcement, but as a story about what was done to their people, and about the fact that the full accounting for that never came. I want to know what you think. The 4 men who were convicted served a fraction of their sentences and were paroled while the Osage Nation protested. Dozens of other killers and co-conspirators were never charged. The guardian system that enabled the theft of Osage wealth for years was never the subject of a serious prosecution. Is what happened in Osage County in the 1920s a story about justice, however incomplete, finally arriving? Or is it a story about a system that protected the people doing the killing for years, punished 4 of them mildly, and called it resolved? Leave your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one. If this case affected you, I would encourage you to look into the Osage Nation directly. Their tribal website documents this history in their own words, and that perspective matters more than any secondary account, including this one. Share this video if it moved you, not for the numbers, but because the Osage people spent decades trying to get the world to understand what happened to them. The least we can do is listen. New video every Thursday. I'll see you next week.